I want you to imagine a clock. Not an ordinary clock. A clock that does not measure time. A clock that measures something far stranger. How much of you is still there? In a small coastal town, that clock exists. Though nobody built it on purpose. It is the tide. Every morning, the water comes in. And every morning, a little more of the town forgets. Professor Leo noticed the pattern before anyone else did. Because Professor Leo was the only person measuring it. This is episode 4 of The Secret Diary of Professor Leo. The frequency of forgetting. Hello, and welcome back. I am very glad you are here. Today's story takes Professor Leo somewhere new. Away from his quiet town. Down to the coast. Where something very old is waking up. And something very human is slipping away. Chapter 1. The letter from Marlow Bay. The letter arrived on ordinary paper, in an ordinary envelope, and Professor Leo very nearly set it aside unread. It was from a retired doctor named Helen Faraday, in a small coastal town called Marlow Bay. She had read one of Professor Leo's published papers, years ago, on memory and resonance. She wrote because something in her town had become impossible to ignore. For the past 4 years, she wrote, the people of this town have been losing memories. Not gradually, the way memory normally fades. In waves. The same time, every single day. Always at high tide. Professor Leo read the letter twice. Then a third time. He was, by nature, deeply suspicious of coincidence. A scientist learns, early in their career, that the universe rarely arranges itself into convenient patterns. When it appears to do so, it usually means something has been missed. Dr. Faraday continued. It began with small things. Forgetting a name. Forgetting where you left your keys. We thought it was simply age, simply stress, simply the sea air making us tired. But for years on, it has not slowed. It has gotten worse. Children are losing words they only just learned. My husband no longer remembers our wedding, though he remembers everything before it. She finished with a single line that Professor Leo would return to many times in the days that followed. It is always the same time. Always the tide. As though something in the water is listening. And taking notes. Professor Leo sat with the letter for a long while. He thought of Eleanor's instruments. Of resonance. Of the idea that memory was not only stored in the mind, but in a kind of pattern that extended, faintly, into the body and the space around it. If memory had a frequency, then perhaps, in theory, something could interfere with that frequency. He packed a case that evening. Not the full machine. That would come later, if needed. But a smaller instrument. One Eleanor had designed for detecting unusual resonance in open environments. He had used it only twice before. both times in places that troubled him afterward. He wrote one line in his diary before leaving. "I do not yet believe in things that listen. But I have learned never to dismiss a pattern simply because it frightens me to take it seriously." Chapter 2. The Town That Forgets on Schedule. Marlow Bay was a small fishing town, built along a curve of grey cliffs, where the houses leaned slightly toward the sea as if listening to it. Dr. Faraday met him at the station. She was perhaps 70, sharp-eyed, with the steady manner of someone who had spent a career delivering bad news calmly. "You'll want to see the harbor first," she said. "Everything happens fastest there." They walked along the seafront as the tide began its slow climb up the stones. Professor Leo noticed, almost immediately, something unusual about the rhythm of the waves. Not their height. Not their sound. Their interval. Waves, ordinarily, arrive in irregular sequences. Close together, then further apart, shaped by wind and current and the shifting floor of the sea. These waves arrived with a strange, deliberate evenness. Like a heartbeat. Like breathing. He said nothing yet. He simply noted it. At the harbor, an elderly fisherman named Tom sat mending a net. The same net, Dr. Faraday said quietly, that he had been mending for 3 days. "He finishes it," she said, "and by the next morning he has forgotten finishing it. So he begins again." Professor Leo crouched beside him. "Tom," he said gently, "do you remember meeting me yesterday?" Tom looked up. Friendly. Blank. "Don't believe we've met," he said. "Lovely morning though, isn't it?" It was, in fact, raining. Professor Leo straightened slowly. He looked out at the water, at the strange, even rhythm of the waves. He opened his case and switched on the small resonance instrument. A thin needle, suspended in a glass dome, designed to twitch in the presence of unusual mental patterns nearby. The needle did not twitch. It rotated. Slowly. Smoothly. Continuously. As though tracking something that moved in a perfect, unbroken circle. Professor Leo had never seen it behave this way. Not once, in 30 years. He looked at the sea. Then at the needle. Then back at the sea. "Dr. Faraday," he said quietly, "I think we should talk to anyone in this town who has lived here the longest." She nodded slowly. "There's only one. Old Agnes, up at the lighthouse. 91 years old. Has she forgotten anything?" Professor Leo asked. Dr. Faraday's expression changed. "That's the strange part," she said. "Agnes hasn't forgotten a single thing. Not in 4 years. Not one day." Chapter 3. The Woman the Sea Forgot to Take. The lighthouse stood on a narrow finger of rock at the edge of the bay, reachable only by a path that vanished completely at high tide. Agnes was small, sharp, and entirely unbothered by Professor Leo's questions, as though she had been waiting a very long time for someone to ask them properly. "For years ago," she said, settling into her chair by the window, "a fishing trawler went down in a storm. The Marin Claire. Lost with all 6 hands." She paused. "They never found the wreck. Not properly. Not where they expected to find it." Professor Leo leaned forward. "Where was it expected to be found?" 40 fathoms, Agnes said. "Sandy bottom. Charted 100 times. Nothing down there but sand and old rope." She looked at him steadily. "But the search boats found something else instead. A trench. Deep. Not on any chart. Hadn't been there the season before." Professor Leo felt something settle quietly in his chest. Not fear exactly. Recognition. "And the forgetting began," he said slowly. "Shortly afterward. Within the month," Agnes confirmed. "Why do you think you haven't forgotten?" he asked. Agnes smiled. A small, knowing smile. "Because I don't sleep near the water," she said. "Haven't in 40 years. Bad hip. I sleep up here, above the rocks, away from the tide line." She tapped the windowsill. "Everyone else in this town sleeps within a few hundred yards of the sea. I'm the only one who doesn't." Professor Leo sat very still. Distance from the water. Proximity to the trench. The rhythm of the tide. The needle, rotating endlessly. Tracking something that moved in a perfect, unbroken circle. He thought of Eleanor's old theory. Resonance carried through proximity. Through repeated exposure. Through patterns the body absorbed without the mind ever noticing. "Agnes," he said carefully, "I would like to bring my instruments down to the trench itself. If a boat can be arranged." She studied him for a long moment. "You'll want to be careful what you go looking for, Professor," she said quietly. "Some things that have been buried a very long time aren't lost. They're waiting." Chapter 4. 40 fathoms down. The boat went out 2 mornings later, when the sea was calm enough to risk it. Professor Leo brought the small resonance instrument, along with a simple recording device. A microphone built to capture sound far below the range of normal hearing. Adapted years earlier for studying deep-sea movement. The trench, when they reached it, was unremarkable to look at. Dark water. A slight discoloration on the surface. Faint and oily. That the fishermen called the slick and avoided without quite knowing why. Professor Leo lowered the microphone. For a long while, there was nothing. The ordinary hiss of deep water. The distant clicking of unseen creatures. Then, faint but unmistakable, a sound began to register on the dial. Not a creature. Not the movement of water against rock. A rhythm. Steady. Patient. Repeating at intervals that matched, almost exactly, the strange even spacing of the waves he had noticed on his first morning in Marlow Bay. He adjusted the instrument, slowing the recording, lowering the pitch into a range his own ears could process. What emerged was not a sound he recognized. It was not mechanical. It was not the call of any sea creature catalogued in any book he owned. It had a structure, a pattern. Almost. And this thought troubled him more than he wished to admit. Almost like breathing. Or like a single, repeated word. Spoken too slowly and too low for a human voice to ever produce. He recorded 20 minutes of it. Then he asked the boat to return to harbor. That evening, alone in his rented room, he played the recording over and over, slowing it further each time, until the pattern began to resolve into something almost like syllables. He could not yet understand it, but he understood, with growing unease, that it was not random. It was a signal. He wrote in his diary that night, "Something at the bottom of that trench is producing a structured sound, at intervals matching the tide, in a location that did not exist on any chart before for years ago. The town's memory is failing at the same rate the signal repeats. I do not yet know what is sending it, but I no longer believe it is sending it by accident." Chapter 5. The Shape Beneath the Slick. The following day, Professor Leo requested permission to lower a small camera, sealed in a watertight casing, down into the trench itself. The fishermen were reluctant, not from fear of the equipment, from a quieter, older reluctance, the kind sailors develop about places the sea itself seems unwilling to explain. "My grandfather used to say," one of them muttered, "that some water remembers what it swallowed, and some water is still hungry." Professor Leo noted this carefully. Without comment, the camera went down slowly. The cable marked at each fathom. For the first 30 fathoms, there was only the expected darkness, broken occasionally by small shapes. Fish. Drifting weed. The pale curve of something that might once have been part of the Marine Claire. At 38 fathoms, the light from the camera began to behave strangely. Not failing. Bending. As though passing through water of a slightly different density than the water above it. At 40 fathoms, the trench opened. And there, resting on a floor of fine grey silt, was a shape that Professor Leo would spend the rest of that night trying and failing to describe accurately in his diary. It was large, larger than the trawler that had gone down beside it, its broken hull lying nearby like a child's toy dropped beside something far older. Its surface was not metal, not rock, something closer to the look of old bone, though far too smooth, too symmetrical, curved in patterns that suggested neither natural geology nor any manufacturing process Professor Leo recognized. And along one side, faint and rhythmic, a soft inner light pulsed, in time with the signal, in time with the tide. The camera's microphone, still recording, captured the sound at far closer range than before. This time, slowed down later that night, the pattern resolved further. Not words, not quite, but something disturbingly close to intention. A signal, repeating without variation, structured exactly the way a distress call is structured. Short, patient, endlessly repeating, waiting for something to answer. Professor Leo sat back from the recording, his hands very still. "It is not malfunctioning," he wrote. "It is calling. The question I must now answer is, calling to whom? And what does it intend to do? If nothing answers." Chapter 6. What the tide takes with it. Over the following days, Professor Leo shifted his attention from the trench to the town itself. He began interviewing residents methodically, the way he might once have studied subjects connected to the memory machine. A pattern emerged with troubling clarity. The memories disappearing were not random. They were not simply old memories, nor simply unimportant ones. They were, specifically, memories connected to identity, names, relationships, the small details that made a person recognizably themselves, rather than simply a collection of habits and routines. A fisherman forgot his daughter's name, but not how to mend a net. A baker forgot her own wedding day, but not the recipe for her bread. It was as though something were carefully removing the architecture of a person, while leaving the furniture intact. Professor Leo thought of his small resonance instrument, of the needle rotating endlessly, tracking a pattern that moved in a perfect, unbroken circle, not absorbing memory randomly, harvesting it methodically, patiently, as though gathering material for something being slowly assembled, fragment by fragment, beneath 40 fathoms of cold grey water. He returned to Agnes at the lighthouse. "You said something was waiting," he said. "Not lost. Waiting. What did you mean?" Agnes was quiet for a long moment. "My grandmother used to tell a story," she said eventually. about things that come from very far away and very long ago. Older than people. Older, even, than the idea of people. She looked out at the water. She said sometimes such a thing arrives broken. Lost. Calling for help that will never come. Because whatever it once belonged to is long gone. Scattered across the stars or the centuries or wherever such things come from. And if no help comes? Professor Leo asked quietly. Agnes turned to look at him directly. Then eventually, she said, it tries to build new help. Out of whatever is closest. Professor Leo felt the full weight of the pattern settle into place. A distress call. Broadcasting endlessly. Drawing in the only material available to it. Human minds. Human memory. The architecture of identity. Harvested patiently across for slow years. Gathered toward some purpose he still did not fully understand. Agnes, he said carefully. I believe whatever is down there is not attacking this town. No, Agnes agreed quietly. I don't imagine it sees it that way at all. I think, Professor Leo said, it is lonely. Chapter 7. The Sound Beneath the Sound. That night, Professor Leo returned to his recordings with new purpose. If the signal was a distress call, calling for something specific, then understanding what it called for might matter more than understanding what it was. He slowed the recording further than before, far beyond what any normal ear could process. Stretching 20 minutes of sound into nearly 6 hours of careful listening. And there, buried beneath the dominant rhythm, he found something he had missed entirely on his first analysis. A second pattern. Quieter. Faster. Almost hidden beneath the first. The way a whisper might hide beneath a held, steady note. He worked through the night to isolate it. When he finally separated the two signals, the second pattern revealed something extraordinary. It was not the same signal repeating. It was a response. Faint. Broken. Full of long gaps. As though something were trying, with great difficulty, to answer the call from somewhere very far away. But the answer kept arriving. Incomplete. Professor Leo sat back from his equipment, the implication settling slowly through him. The thing in the trench was not alone in some absolute sense. Something else, somewhere, was trying to reach it. But the connection was failing. Fragmented. As though whatever vast distance or vast time separated them was simply too great for a clean signal to survive the crossing. And so the thing in the trench had begun building its own bridge. Out of memory. Out of the substance of human minds. Gathered patiently. Fragment by fragment. Perhaps in some desperate, half-understood attempt To construct enough structure, enough pattern, enough resonance, to finally complete what the natural signal could not. It was not cruelty. Professor Leo understood this now with unsettling clarity. It was the oldest impulse in the universe, expressed by something that had perhaps never been taught any gentler way to satisfy it. The need to no longer be alone. He wrote in his diary, very late that night, "I do not believe it intends harm in the way a predator intends harm. But intention does not change consequence. If it continues, Marlow Bay will not lose its memory. It will lose itself entirely. And I do not yet know how to make something that has waited, perhaps, for 10,000 years. Understand the difference." Chapter 8. A conversation with something old. Professor Leo made his decision the next morning. He would not destroy the device in the trench. He had neither the means nor, he realized, the desire. Not once he understood what it was reaching for. Instead, he would attempt something far more delicate. He would try to answer it, using his small resonance instrument, modified through the long night with parts borrowed from the recording equipment. He constructed a crude transmitter, capable, he hoped, of producing a signal pattern closely enough to the second sound, the faint and broken response, that it might register as continuation rather than noise. It was, he knew, an enormous risk. He had no certainty the device in the trench could distinguish between a genuine connection and a clumsy human imitation of one. He had no certainty it would not simply absorb whatever he sent toward it, the way it had been absorbing the town. But he had run out of more careful options. That evening, the boat returned to the trench under a sky heavy with cloud. He lowered the transmitter on the same cable that had carried the camera, and he activated it. For a long, terrible moment, nothing happened. The steady rhythm of the distress call continued, unbroken, exactly as it had for 4 years. Then, slowly, the pattern shifted. The light along the shape's surface, previously pulsing in a single steady rhythm, began to flicker in a new, more complex sequence. Searching. Professor Leo adjusted the transmitter carefully, matching its pulse to the fragments he had isolated from the broken second signal. The shape's light steadied. And then, for the first time in 4 years, the distress call changed. It slowed, not stopping, but softening. The patient, endless repetition replaced by something that felt unmistakably like recognition, like a held breath, finally released. Professor Leo sat very still in the small boat, the cable trembling faintly under his hand, and felt, for one unsettling moment, Something that was not quite communication, but was no longer simply noise either. A presence. Vast. Patient. And, for the first time in a very long while, heard. Chapter 9. The tide returns what it took. Over the following week, the change in Marlow Bay was gradual but unmistakable. Old Tom finished mending his net, and, for the first time in 3 days, remembered finishing it the next morning. The baker recalled her wedding day, every detail returning slowly across several mornings, like a photograph developing in reverse. Dr. Faraday's husband remembered her face across the breakfast table, and, by her account, wept for nearly an hour. The harvesting had not reversed instantly. Some memories returned only partially, fragments rejoining other fragments in ways that left small gaps, small uncertainties that might, Dr. Faraday admitted quietly, never fully heal. But it had stopped. The needle on Professor Leo's small instrument, when he finally checked it again before leaving, no longer rotated endlessly. It rested. Quiet. Still. The way it had rested in 30 years of ordinary use. Before Marlow Bay, he returned to the lighthouse on his final morning to say goodbye to Agnes. "You did something down there," she said. It was not a question. "I answered it," Professor Leo said simply. It did not want this town. It wanted to be heard. Those are not always the same hunger, even when they look identical from a distance. Agnes considered this for a long moment, looking out at water that, for the first time in years, moved with no strange evenness in its rhythm at all. And now, she asked. Now, Professor Leo said, "I believe it is still down there. Still waiting. But waiting differently. The way a person waits once they know, finally, that someone is coming. Rather than the way a person waits when they have stopped believing anyone ever will." He looked out at the calm grey sea. "Whether anything ever does come," he added quietly, "I cannot say. Some distances may simply be too great. But it is no longer reaching into this town to bridge that distance. That, at least, I could give it." Chapter 10. What Professor Leo carried home. On the train back, Professor Leo wrote for a long time in his diary, watching the coast give way slowly to the familiar green fields of home. He thought of Eleanor, of her belief that memory was never only personal, that it moved, in subtle ways, through bodies and places and the spaces between people, far more than anyone fully understood. He thought of the needle, rotating endlessly in a perfect circle, tracking a hunger it had no way to judge as good or cruel, only as present. He thought, too, of something Agnes had said, almost in passing, as he left the lighthouse. "Funny thing about the sea," she had said. "It doesn't take anything that isn't already, in some way, looking to be carried." He was not certain what she had meant by it, but he suspected, somehow, that it mattered. In his diary, his final entry for the journey read, "I went to Marlow Bay believing I would find a malfunction, an illness, a problem with a clear cause and, eventually, a clear solution. I found, instead, something ancient and entirely alone, reaching across a distance I cannot measure, using the only material it could find nearby. Us. It did not see itself as a danger. I am not certain it sees itself as anything at all, in the way we mean the word. It simply needed, and need, when it goes unanswered long enough, will reach for whatever lies closest. I wonder, sometimes, how much of what we call malice in the world is simply this. Not cruelty, loneliness, grown so vast and so old, that it no longer recognizes the shape of the harm it causes. If that is true, then perhaps the most important question is never what is reaching for us, but whether anyone is willing to answer. He closed the diary as the train pulled into his own small station, the familiar field settling quietly into evening light. And somewhere, 40 fathoms beneath a calm grey sea, something old continued waiting. Differently, now, but waiting still. That is the end of episode 4 of The Secret Diary of Professor Leo. The frequency of forgetting. Thank you so much for listening today. I hope this story unsettled you. Just a little. In the best possible way. That is exactly what this kind of story should do. Before you go, here are your 2 questions for today. If loneliness alone, without any cruelty at all, could cause real harm, would that change how you judge it? And do you think every distress call deserves an answer, even when we do not fully understand what is calling? Think about that quietly today, or leave a comment below. I would love to know what you think. In our next episode, Professor Leo discovers that the device in the trench was not the only one of its kind, and something closer to home has been listening for far longer than anyone realized. Until next time, thank you for learning English with me today. Keep listening, keep wondering, and as we say in Britain, cheers, and speak soon.